Welcome back to Living with a Classic, and if you've been following the channel, you can probably guess that my favorite engine of all time is the Jaguar V12. This year marks 50 years of that legendary engine, which first came out in the Series 3 E-Type in 1971. So, since I love working on these, I almost can't believe they're 50 years old because the whole design is still pretty modern and they're still a fantastic engine. So to celebrate this legendary powerhouse, I have decided to do a video series on this engine now during the spring. There will be probably about 4 videos on this engine, which I think that you guys will really enjoy. They're all really different and they're all kind of different from what I've had on this channel before, so I think you guys will, like I said, really enjoy that. I've already made a lot of videos here on the channel on maintenance on these engines, like everything from simple oil changes to doing all the fuel hoses and injectors, which is very important on these cars. Coolant hoses, also very important, coolant flush, and just how to tune and set them up. There have been a lot of videos here on the channel, so if you want to see any of those and you haven't seen them, I'll put a link to them down below in the description. You can check those out. But here is actually a car that's not mine on the channel. I usually just feature my cars on the channel, but this is a customer's very late built in, I think, November, December 91, so the register is 92, I believe. Daimler 66, which is basically a Jaguar XJ12, just with a lot nicer trim. It was dropped off a few days ago for major service work. So all those things we mentioned before, fuel hoses, we're going to do a tune-up. It also has a little bit of funny sound when you figure out what that is. And just really go through the car and make sure it is all there and perfect. But body-wise and everything else, and interior, this is an excellent car. It just needs a little bit of maintenance under there. So I'm about to take this thing out for a test drive, just to see what it drives like, to know what sort of things I need to look out for in the workshop, and just sort of get a base of what the car feels like. So I'm going to bring you guys along, and we're going to pretend that, let's say you want to buy one of these cars, and you applied to an ad. You've come to someone's garage where we're right now. You've seen the car for the first time. We're going to walk around it. We're not going to do body work and things like that. We can do a buyer's guide in the future on these cars and on the XJS as well. However, we're going to just have a focus on the engine and go for a test drive and see what you need to look out for if you're buying a Jaguar V12. When you're seeing one of these cars for the first time, hopefully it is probably sitting inside somewhere, and hopefully it hasn't been run, so it's still cold. The nice thing about it sitting inside is that when you pull it back later, you can see if there's any dribbles on the floor. I know that this floor is pretty clean, and I put the car here yesterday, so when we back up later, you can easily see if there are any leaks. You don't want these engines to leak. People say, oh, all old British engines leak, but I have 2 V12s and neither of them leak oil. So it's definitely possible to have one that doesn't. And here we have the 5.3 liter V12, and everything looks pretty much as it should. So you see you have 2 banks over here, 2 sets of air filters. You see, it's nice to see a bunch of original stickers everywhere, but this is definitely not an overly detailed engine bay. Everything is there. It's not really covered in oil or anything, but no one has been in here, yesterday with a pressure washer. So this is a nice thing to see. It is definitely not, caked in oil anywhere and stuff like that, but it hasn't recently been cleaned. So this is a nice, honest engine bay. I like to see that. I also like to see this, the insulation here, that it is still intact and not all broken. Often these can fall down and sort of fall into a million pieces. A theory that I have is that if you have one of these engines that's overheated or run hot a lot, then you can see that sometimes on here, this almost is a little bit burnt. That is one thing we're going to get to a little bit later. Big Achilles heel of this engine is you don't ever want them to overheat. I read in a book I have inside on buying these cars from many years ago, and it says that basically, if they was talking about the XJS, but it's the same engine that, if it overheats and you're out driving, pull over, put the keys out of the ignition, put them on the seat and walk home. It'll be the cheapest walk of your life. And that is pretty much saying something, because these are really expensive engines to rebuild. Yes, bodywork and things are expensive in these cars, but it's equally important that these engines are running well. So it's under here. You can feel that everything is nice and cold. It's a good place to start. So let's start by looking at hoses, which is just an easy thing. So we got two upper radiator hoses, one there, one over there. And you can sort of just have a feel at them. Yeah, they still feel soft. So they're not all hard and brittle, but they're definitely not brand new. So that's one thing you might ask the previous owner or the person selling the car. Do you know when the coolant system was last changed and flushed? Do you know when the hoses were last replaced? If they don't know, then budget for replacing hoses and doing all of that, because that's something that you should do periodically. It really depends. Some say 5 years, some say 10 years. I think on cars like these, if they're stored correctly and not in really hot climates, maybe every 10 years. If it's a hot climate, every 5 years. Moving over here, this is the oil dipstick. It's pretty easy to see. It's usually green. You can pull this up, and it's the first time I'm seeing what the oil looks like. And you can see, if that will focus, it is right on the minimum of the full range. So the full range is from there to there, and it's pretty dark looking. And you see, there is the absolute minimum. So it's definitely halfway up. So it's not completely empty. So it's not completely full, it's dark, so it is due for a change. You can smell it. It smells like oil, doesn't smell like gasoline, so that's really good. So that's also something you can ask, the previous owner. When was the last time this thing had an oil change? If you see that it's basically down halfway and pretty dark, if you have papers that's done really recently, you probably have a pretty dirty engine inside, but if he says, oh no, it was 2 years ago, then yeah, that looks like maybe about 2-year-old oil. Just budget for a service. Not really a big deal on these cars. It's something you can easily do yourself. However, it is quite a lot of oil, close to 10 liters in one of these. So that's something you need to think of. But nothing is small on these cars. Everything is just a lot of oil. One other thing you can look at and ask is, of course, the fuel hoses. And these look pretty original. And that's something that we already talked about the owner for this car. He's come here to change the fuel hoses and do some other things. But that's one thing you can have a look at, and tell the owner of the car, if you see a car like this with like 30-year-old or 20-year-old fuel hoses, say that those need to be changed, and you can budget accordingly when you buy the car. Another thing to have a look at, of course, is the distributor down here. These plug wires, they're not terrible, but they're definitely not brand new. Cap looks pretty dirty, so that's something maybe you need to budget for as well. New cap and rotor plug wires and plugs. Ask for when the last time the plugs were changed. On the V12, the ones up front here under the AC compressor are really difficult to get at. You can do it with a specialist tool, or you can move the air compressor to the side, which I have shown in a video how to do that. So often they get neglected. So if you have a misfire on one of these engines, it's often that it might just be running on 10 cylinders or 11, and that one of these plugs is 3 times as old as all the other ones and in really bad shape. So one more thing we're going to check. We'll walk over to the other side. We'll check the transmission. We can't check the level when it's running, but we can check the color of the transmission fluid. Over on this side, we have the transmission dipstick. Like I said, we're not going to be able to check the level of it running, but you can feel how it shifts later. And if it shifts weirdly, check the level, but just pull it up. And that looks pretty light, actually, not that dark. It should be a light see-through red when it's brand new, and if it's brown or black, it needs to be changed. Brown needs to be changed, black, it's probably bad, but smell it. As long as it doesn't smell burnt, it's pretty much fine, I say that. Transmission fluid doesn't look bad. It would not be, bad to possibly change it. It doesn't really want to go back in. I'll need 2 hands to do that. It would not be a bad idea to change it at some point, but definitely it is not bad. 2 more things we can check. We can check the coolant level, and we can check the power steering fluid as well. Power steering pump is right down here in a very inconvenient location, basically under the upper radiator hose on this bank. So the easiest way to get it off is actually to sort of bend your arm a little bit, unscrew the lid, and pull it up, and let's see what it looks like. Okay, so I am seeing oil there, which is on the correct level for cold, and then there's a hot level. So we'll put that in, or we'll smell it. If it smells burnt, it's definitely bad, time for changing. And if it looks, overly black, or same sort of as the automatic transmission, but that is up to the correct level. It's a little dark, so I mean it could be due to change, but not really a big deal. I have removed both caps for the coolant system. There is one cap over there, and there's one expansion tank. You can have a look at the inside of the cap. You see a little bit of buildup here. I mean, that's really nothing weird on such an old car, almost 30 years old. To check the level, you can shine and just make sure you see some in here. Up here, you should be able to see coolant a couple of inches down. So if you can feel it with your finger right down there, I can feel a bit of coolant. So coolant level is correct. If you're lucky, you can maybe see what it looks like, but you want to see documentation of that coolant being changed regularly. When these cars were new, with the coolant you had back then, they recommended every 2 years to change and flush it. More modern coolant, you could probably stretch that to 5 years, but it should really be changed very, very regular. This is an all aluminum engine, and you don't want any corrosion inside these. So now you can put all of this back on, and you're basically ready to start the car and go for a test drive. One thing, of course, you can do, especially if on concrete like I am, so just lay down under the car and see if you see any, dribbles on the ground. I can't actually see anything. This thing seems to be pretty tight. I will have a look one more time when I pull it out of the garage, but so far it looks really good. Once you get in the car, you're ready to start it up. I'm leaving the bonnet open so I can have a little bit look at the engine just as it starts up. You can also have a helper at the back to see if it's blowing any smoke. You can see if valve stem seals are bad. But these things should start up pretty much right away. Oil pressure takes a little bit time to build on these engines, and it's completely normal. We'll talk more about oil pressure later, but let's see. We got everything going. Here, the fuel pump prime. Foot off the gas, these things should start up right away. It's idling a little bit too low cold. That is another common issue on these things. That is your auxiliary air valve, which is just your idle speed control valve. There might be something wrong with that. That's something we're going to check. But I'll bring it up to about 1,000 RPMs, which should be a good cold idle on these cars, just with my foot. You see we got great oil pressure building up here. Once these are warm and idling, they'll have very low oil pressure, and it might be alarming, but that's sort of okay. Once you're driving, if you say about 10 pounds of oil pressure per 1,000 RPMs on these engines, and it should cap off at, pretty much, 60 pounds usually. It sort of depends on the year and model, but this seems fine. It is charging above 13 volts. I'm not hearing any weird sounds or anything, but let's go out and listen to the engine. Let it go down. It's idling a little bit low, but that's something that we can sort out in a future video. And this thing is sounding beautiful. These should be very, very quiet engines. However, the injectors are quite noisy, so what you're hearing is not the tappets. You should never hear the tappets or valve train in this engine at all. You shouldn't hear the timing chain either, but you will hear the injectors clicking, and you'll just hear a great suction sound from this side, because this is basically where all the idle air goes through. So it doesn't really idle through the throttle butterflies here. It idles through the auxiliary air valve here, which I think is set up incorrectly, and that's why it's a little bit too low. It's brand new, so it should be about 1,000 RPM for cold, and 750 when it warms up. But you can gently just open up the throttle. It should be very nice and smooth. And there is that little bit of an odd sound, which the owner did complain about with this car. I haven't checked it out yet. I have two theories of what it is. I believe some oil filters on these cars make weird sounds. So you should use an original Jaguar oil filter. So I think that is maybe the issue, because I'm getting a weird sound here. You get a cavitation in the oil filter, and it could also be the power steering pump. But all these things are things you can test out on the test drive, which we're going to go on right now. These engines should warm up pretty quickly. I probably had it running for about 5 minutes now, just idling around. Now I'm just pulling away. It is basically halfway up to normal operating temperature. They have two thermostats, one in each side. However, you only measure temperature from one side. So
Technically, you could have one side running higher than the other. That's why it's important to change thermostats and things pretty regularly. You can also use an infrared laser thermometer to check, that the banks are running evenly. That is part of the tuning, and that's something I've gone through in previous videos. So what should it feel like pulling away? It should be absolutely dead silent if you have a stock exhaust system and stock intake and everything. These should be really, really quiet. The only thing you might hear is the fuel pump in the back. They can be a little bit on the noisy side, and that's completely normal, especially on the saloons. You hear them less on the XJS. It should shift very smoothly, especially if you have the GM Turbo 400 transmission. If you have the earlier, like an early 70s car, if you have a Borg Warner 12, still a smooth transmission, but not as smooth as these. You should feel no weird vibrations from the engines, nothing like that. It should be smooth all the way through. But take it out like I am now, just some small country roads to start with, if you're lucky, and just have it warm up. And then once it's warmed up, you can go out somewhere else and actually give it some. Of course, you shouldn't completely floor it. It's not your car, but make sure that it revs up nicely and shifts, in a nice, smooth way. It's definitely not as smooth as a modern car. You will feel the shifts, but they should be very, very smooth. On a saloon like this one, make sure that you test both fuel tanks, but before you do it, ask the owner, are both fuel tanks working? Hit the switch, make sure it runs on both tanks, make sure that the gas gauge actually moves, because there should be most likely a different level of fuel in both tanks. That is a good thing to know, because that's also quite expensive to sort out if it's not working correctly, and that is something that, of course, have a look at. We'll talk more about that when I actually do a buyer's guide for the XJ cars in general. If you're looking at an XJS, you just have one basically main fuel tank. There's a surge tank, but we'll go into that in the XJS videos. But make sure that all of that is working as it should. I'm going to continue driving here, and then we're going to pull out on a little bit of a bigger road and get up to some higher speeds and see how this engine does. I'm about to pull out here on a little bit faster 2-lane road. There's a stop sign, so I'm going to do a little bit of an acceleration, just feel how it shifts. I'm not going to floor it at all. It's not my car. It's not your car either when you go and look at one. But, check it out with still being respectful to the engine. It's not completely warmed up either, but it is up to temperature according to the coolant, but the oil is definitely not warm yet. All right, actually the wheel, we got some bad traction there, but let's see, got second gear. And it's pulling nicely. It's 2,000, 2,500 RPMs. I think I'll pull it to about 3. And there it shifts down to 2. And we're already exceeding the speed limit here. So that's the thing, these are still quick cars, even though they're very old in design, and even, this one is one of the newest ones, and it's almost 30 years old. But these engines are still powerful. They're torque monsters. I mean, they're absolutely very, very powerful still. And a V12 Jag should still get up and move fairly quickly. So now I'm cruising along. I am going to just slow down a little bit. Maybe to about 50 kilometers. There's that sound again. I really do think it's some weird oil filter or incorrect oil. You should have 20 W50 in these engines pretty much always. Could be different if you're in extremely hot climate or extremely cold, but that is a general rule of thumb. So I'm going to see if it kicks down the second. And yes, it does. That was pretty smooth. Pulling up again to 3,000, and it shifts down. So transmission is working as it should. Shifts up and down. Sometimes you could have some issues with these wanting to shift down. There is some micro switches up by the throttle pedal that could be broken. There's also a vacuum thing. So if it's not shifting up and down, kicking down, really shifting up it should. But if it doesn't kick down immediately, it could be a pretty easy fix. So if everything else is smooth, you should definitely talk to the owner about that, that you need to sort that out. But it's not the end of the world. You can most likely have that sorted pretty quickly. So I'm driving along here. Engine's turning 2,000 RPMs, and it's up at the level 5 here on the scale for oil pressure, so that is really great. It went down to about 3 on this car when I was idling over there before we pulled out. We'll see what it is when I get back home after my little shakedown drive, but everything is feeling really good. Of course, I am checking for other things as well because I'm test driving this for a customer before I work on it. But you know, we'll go into test drives of these cars in general in a future video. And I'm going to continue to drive here, come back to the house, we'll pull up and we'll see how the engine is doing then. And we made it back to the house. So let's put this thing in park. And all right, we got a little too high idle. Should be about 750. So definitely something going on with the AED, auxiliary air valve, which does the idle on these cars. It is brand new, so it's probably just not set up correctly with the throttle butterflies and everything. I've done videos on how to do that, and that is the most common thing that's wrong with these cars is throttle butterflies not set up correctly. But oil pressure is good, charging's been good the whole time. Temperature has stayed pretty much right there the whole time, which is great. But let's see what the oil pressure is when I bring it up a little bit. So you see T-valve, I mean, it is skyrocketing. So this is a very healthy engine. But before you shut it off, you can go out and just look in the engine bay again with it running. And that is very nice and smooth. I mean, you should not be able to feel a V12 running with your fingers on it. That's how smooth these engines are. But now it's time to use your nose. Do you smell anything burnt? Do you smell oil? Do you smell coolant? Look around the valve cover gaskets, especially around there. They're prone to leaking, especially in the back. Does that look wet? Because that is quite a big job. It's a pretty easy job, but there's a lot to remove. You know, all of this needs to come off just to get to valve cover gaskets, which in themselves cost pretty much nothing, but you got to replace a bunch of other things at the same time. So this is a good time to have a look at that. Can you hear any exhaust leaks down here? Because all of that is pretty much a pain to sort out as well. So all these little things, just listen for them. Bring it up off idle a little bit. Is it still as smooth? Does it want to accelerate away, rev up right away like this one? It really should. And here is a great thing now. There you go, the electric fan came on. So that is working and helping keeping this thing cool. And there it turned off again. That's perfect. This is a cool day, so shouldn't be on for long. It should also come on with the AC, which I know is not working on this car, which is also another thing I am going to work on. But I think we can shut this off now and say that overall, this is a pretty healthy V12 engine. And if this was one that was up for sale, I would definitely recommend to buy this one. And that's it for this first video in my 50th anniversary series of the Jaguar V12. So here are the things you need to look out for when buying one of these. There are, of course, tools you should bring along when you look at them. Have a flashlight so you can look underneath for oil. If it's not, you know, on a concrete surface, you can easily see it, or if you don't know how long it's been sitting there. Those are good things. Always bring some rags. If you have an infrared thermometer, bring one of those and check that both banks are running evenly. I will do that in a future video when we go through more things on this car. I'm going to do a lot of service work on this for the customer. And even though it is running pretty nicely now, and I say it's a very sound good engine, it's going to be absolutely perfect when it leaves the workshop here. Because these V12s, even when they're not set up correctly, they still run fantastic. But when they are set up just right, they're magnificent engines. And I want to touch on one thing. This will be in a future video. There's a lot of things about reliability issues with these engines. Most of that is complete nonsense. It's people, mechanics, not knowing how to handle these engines. They're fantastically built engines, so the block wise and heads and all that is very strong. They can take a lot of miles. The only thing they can't really take is overheating, and no aluminum engine can take overheating, so that's not really a weird thing. They should also have frequent oil changes. That helps with keeping the valve train quiet. These cars usually don't get driven that much, so just make sure it has an annual oil change, because I mean, most of these will not have exceeded the mileage for the oil over a year. Maybe when they were new, but then you want to see service history on the car. It's had all its services, of course. But otherwise, a good big stack of receipts is a good thing to go along with one of these cars, because it will have been in the shop quite a bit over the years, and it's good to have kept old MOTs or inspections. All of that is a good thing, but regular oil changes, but almost more important than that is the regular coolant flushes on these engines and having that documented. Knowing when all the belts were done last. There's 5 of them. It's quite a bit of a job. So if you're not a home mechanic, but I think you can be on these engines. That's really what I do on this channel. I'll show you guys how to work on these. It's quite expensive to take one of these to a shop, just because everything takes quite a long time. It's a labor-intensive engine to work on. I love working on them. They're absolutely brilliant, but they're labor-intensive. But it's easy to get parts for them. Parts are pretty cheap, and there's nothing really, you don't really need any specialist tools or anything. You can do a lot of this at home. So I hope that you guys like this video and you're looking forward to the rest of this series. It will feature lots of other V12 Jaguars. It will feature also some interviews with some very, very interesting people about the V12 engine. Anyways, if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends, leave a comment down below what you think of the Jaguar V12. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, please do subscribe to the channel. It really does help out a lot. And remember to ring the bell so you see when I upload future videos. So until next time, I'm Adam, and this was Living with a Classic. I'll see you soon.